The train groaned like a wounded beast as it crested the rise into Fort Glory, Wyoming, its wheels shearing frost from the iron rails. Snow flurried at the windows, casting a shifting veil over the plains beyond, open, merciless land that seemed to breathe with an ancient hunger. The station platform, a clapboard slab braced against wind and time, waited like a judgment. Inside the last car, two women sat pressed together on the worn bench, their figures nearly identical beneath woolen coats and hand-me-down shawls. Hazel and Lark Monroe were twins, 23 winters old, though hardship had aged their eyes beyond the years they'd counted. One had a scar high on her cheekbone, thin as a thread of silver. The other bore no visible marks, but her silence weighed heavier than stone. Hazel watched the frost paint patterns on the glass, her gloved fingers worrying the handle of the leather valise between her boots. The smell of soot and iron clung to her clothes. She glanced at her sister, who was staring straight ahead, lips slightly parted as though breathing through the ache of memory. "This is the last stop," Hazel said, soft enough that it needn't carry past Lark's ears. Lark nodded once. Her hands were folded, unmoving. The rings of bruising on her wrists had faded, but not the tightness in her posture. She hadn't spoken more than 20 words since Pittsburgh. Hazel had learned to speak for them both. The letter lay folded in Hazel's coat pocket, worn thin from rereading. It was from a man named Elias Brandt, a rancher on the edge of nowhere. Widower, age 35, no children, seeks companionship and help with land, will provide safe dwelling and fair treatment. God-fearing, non-drinker. The ad had run in the Chicago Tribune's matrimonial section. The reply Hazel had sent in trembling script hadn't mentioned the truth, not their fleeing, nor the men they were running from, nor the gun Hazel had smuggled beneath her skirts. Elias didn't know he'd written to two women. The platform creaked beneath their boots as they stepped down into the world. The wind bit, smelling of juniper and far-off smoke. Fort Glory was more a gathering of structures than a town. A saloon with cracked windows, a mercantile store, a church listing on its foundation, and a handful of cabins scattered like seeds tossed by a careless hand. At the edge, a man stood beside a chestnut gelding and a sled wagon, bundled in a shearling coat and black gloves. Elias Brandt was not a young man, nor old. His face bore the quiet erosion of grief, lines that carved deeper near the eyes, a mouth set in a habit of silence. His hair was the color of last autumn's wheat, though threads of gray shone beneath his brimmed hat. He held himself like a man who'd forgotten how to expect anything at all. Hazel stepped forward, throat dry. "Mr. Brandt." He nodded once, his eyes swept over them, not lingering. "Miss Monroe." "Yes, sir, and this is my sister, Lark." She waited for judgment, for refusal. None came. "Twins," he said after a beat, as though the word cost him effort. "I got room. Let's be on the way before the light fades." No mention of surprise, no protest, just a man shaped by loss, perhaps so hollowed by it he no longer questioned what he was given. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour, through snow-laced woods and pale stretches of prairie. Lark wrapped herself in a blanket, her face turned toward the trees, eyes wide and unblinking. Hazel kept one hand on the valise near the pistol. She watched Elias from the corner of her eye. He drove the horses with care, his posture rigid, as though any softness might invite collapse. Eventually, the land rose into low hills. The Brandt homestead came into view, a squat cabin with a pitched roof, smoke curling from its chimney. A barn leaned against a fence, and a pair of goats wandered near the corral, shaking frost from their coats. Inside, the warmth hit like a balm. The hearth blazed, throwing orange light across the wooden walls. The furniture was spare but sturdy. A long table bore signs of recent cleaning. Everything was neat, too neat, like it hadn't been lived in for years. "You'll sleep in the loft," Elias said, pointing to the ladder. "Water from the well. I'll fix something to eat." Lark drifted upstairs without a word. Hazel turned to him, heart thudding. "You knew it was both of us." He shrugged, kneeling to stoke the fire. "Figured something was wrong when your letter said we, not I, but I ain't picky. You need it out. I got land enough." "Why would you do that? Take us both in just like that?" He didn't look up, because the house was too quiet before, and I figured maybe it was time someone needed me again. Hazel stood there, aching with a strange mix of sorrow and awe. A man who didn't ask questions. A man who'd been broken by something silent and slow and had lived on anyway. They were three strangers beneath a single roof, each carrying histories they dared not name. But the fire burned steady, and outside, the snow kept falling, as if it too were trying to cover what had come before. The days that followed were thick with unspoken things. Elias rose before the sun, moving with quiet precision through his morning chores. Hazel learned his patterns by their sounds, the creak of barn doors, the thud of feed sacks, the low murmur of his voice when he spoke to the animals. He was a man of rhythm, not noise. He made no effort to fill the silence and asked for nothing but the work itself. Hazel took to the hearth and pantry, grateful for the distraction of flour and kindling. Lark wandered like a ghost, drifting between rooms with eyes fixed on something only she could see. She still hadn't spoken since they'd arrived. Sometimes she sat by the window for hours, her breath clouding the pain as she watched the road behind them. On the fourth evening, snow fell harder. The wind pressed against the cabin like a thing alive. Elias brought in extra wood, shook the cold from his shoulders, and glanced toward the kitchen. "You cook like you've been doing it for years," he said, almost like a question. Hazel was peeling potatoes at the counter. Her hands didn't stop. "I have. Our ma died when we were girls. Lark was always better at mending, I was better at baking. That's how we got by." He nodded, stepping aside to let her pass with the pot. They didn't speak again until after supper. Lark had gone to bed early. Hazel stayed near the fire, her sewing in her lap, though the needle barely moved. Elias sat in his chair, polishing his boots, his posture thoughtful. "You don't strike me as someone who runs," he said, after a long stretch of nothing. Hazel's hands stilled. "I'd rather be someone who stayed, but we didn't have the choice." He glanced up. It wasn't just a hard life then. She looked into the flames. No, it was worse. Elias nodded slow. He didn't press, and Hazel felt something inside her, something tight and frayed, eased by a thread's breadth. She spoke again, quieter. "Our father drank. He started hitting Ma first. Then when she passed, it was us. Lark tried to marry out of it, chose a man who said kind things. Turned out he was worse." Elias didn't move. His face didn't change, but the air between them shifted, grew heavier. "She got out," Hazel continued. "I got her out, and we ran, that's the short of it." "I won't ask more," Elias said, "but you ever need help carrying it, you say." Hazel blinked hard at the firelight. It wasn't kindness that undid her, it was its quietness, its lack of demand, as if her hurt didn't need proving. Winter deepened. The wind grew more bitter. Elias showed Hazel how to trap rabbits, how to sharpen the blade for skinning. Lark began coming down from the loft earlier each morning, lingering near the hearth longer each night. Once, Hazel returned from the well to find her sister bent over the mending, stitching a torn cuff on Elias' coat. He hadn't asked her to. They were still strangers in many ways, but the shape of their lives began to bend toward each other. There was comfort in that, in the simple routines, in the act of doing. Then came the morning a hawk struck the chicken coop. Hazel heard the commotion first, feathers flying, wood splintering, the sharp cry of dying hens. She burst from the cabin with the rifle Elias had left beside the door. He was already there, crouched beside the coop with the hawk dead at his feet, his forearm bleeding from a claw mark. Hazel dropped to her knees beside him. "You're hurt." Scratched, he winced but didn't pull away as she inspected the wound. Blood welled in narrow ribbons along his skin. Her fingers trembled. "It needs cleaning. You need stitches." He nodded once, breath fogging in the cold. "I'll manage." Inside, she washed the cut, stitched it in silence. Her hands were steady now, her face tight with concentration. "You've done this before," Elias murmured. Hazel didn't look up. "He used to break Lark's skin open. I learned fast." Elias didn't answer. But when she finished, his hand found hers, not in thanks, not in sympathy. Just rested there, warm and solid, as if to say he understood the weight she carried and would not let it crush her alone. That night Lark sat nearer to the fire than she had before. She said nothing, but Hazel noticed the way her gaze lingered on Elias. Not with longing, but with something else, something gentler. Recognition, perhaps, of someone who knew what it was to be hurt and not retreat. Later, as they lay in their shared bed in the loft, Hazel whispered into the dark. "Do you feel safe?" Lark didn't answer at first, then so faint Hazel barely heard it. "Not yet, but I feel less afraid." Hazel turned her face into the quilt. Below them, the fire crackled low. Outside, the wind began to rise again, but this time, it sounded like it was passing by, not pressing in. Spring did not arrive gently. It came with a brittle wind that snapped branches still heavy with ice, a thaw that turned the ground to muck and made every chore harder. The creek swelled with snowmelt, roaring louder each day, and the first green shoots pushed stubbornly through the wet soil like hope refusing to stay buried. Elias taught Hazel how to read the buds on the trees, how to know which would bloom first and which would bear fruit. Lark spent her afternoons in the garden plot, sleeves rolled, hands in the dirt. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice had changed, less like glass on edge, more like something waking from a long sleep. One afternoon, Hazel watched her sister kneel to replant a sprouting onion that had been unearthed by the storm. Lark's fingers were tender, her mouth drawn in quiet focus. Elias came up beside Hazel without a sound. "She's coming back," he said. Hazel nodded, little by little. "You too." Hazel turned to him, but he didn't elaborate. His eyes were on Lark, and in them was a gentleness Hazel hadn't seen before. Not just patience, but pride. That night a storm rolled in from the west. The sky cracked wide open, spilling lightning and wind like judgment. The cabin creaked and shuddered, but the fire held, and so did they. In the middle of the night, Hazel woke to find Lark standing at the window, her hands gripping the sill. Thunder rattled the panes. "He's here," Lark whispered. Hazel's blood froze. She rose slowly, crossing to her sister's side. "What do you mean?" Lark's face was pale, her breath shallow. "I saw a man, near the barn, just for a second." Hazel's hand went to her pistol, kept beneath the mattress since their first night. Elias was already coming down the ladder, pulling on his coat. "Stay inside," he said, "both of you." Hazel followed him out, heart pounding. Rain lashed the yard, turning earth to mire. Elias moved like someone used to threats, his rifle steady, his eyes sharp. They found no sign of the intruder, no boot prints, no broken branches, no shifting shadows. But Hazel believed Lark. The next morning, Elias installed a bolt on the door, fortified the window frames. He said little, but he kept his rifle closer after that, and Hazel noticed how often he scanned the horizon now, how his hand drifted near his belt even in silence. Weeks passed, no other signs came. Maybe it had been the storm playing tricks. Or maybe the man had seen the strength in Elias, the guarded unity in the way the three of them moved now, and thought better of his intentions. Still, the fear lingered like a bruise. Then one morning, Lark asked if she could go into town. It was a small request, but a powerful one. She had not spoken of the world beyond the homestead since their arrival. Hazel offered to go in her stead, but Lark shook her head. "I need to see it, need to know I'm not running anymore." Elias hitched the wagon without a word, just nodded once as she climbed aboard. Hazel stood in the yard and watched them leave, her hands aching from how tightly she held them. They returned at dusk. Lark was quiet but not hollow. She carried a small parcel of fabric, and her cheeks were pink from the wind. Hazel met them at the steps. "Everything all right?" Lark nodded, then, miracle of miracles, smiled. "There was a boy at the mercantile," she said. 6 or 7, he gave me a daisy from a tin cup and told me I looked like a picture. His mother apologized, but I wasn't afraid, not even a little." Elias said nothing, just looked at her like the storm had broken and sunlight had finally found its way back. That night the three of them sat around the fire. Hazel mended a shirt, Lark worked at her fabric, and Elias carved a small sparrow from a piece of driftwood. No one spoke for a long time, and no one needed to. In the quiet, something had shifted. The space between them had filled, not with words, but with the steady hum of healing. Hazel caught Elias watching her once, his expression open in a way she hadn't seen before. She held his gaze for a breath longer than she meant to. "Why haven't you remarried before now?" she asked, the question too bold once it was out. He ran his thumb over the sparrow's wing. "I did, once, years back. She died with the child. After that, I stopped thinking in futures." Hazel's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "I ain't told anyone that in 10 years, he said, voice low. "Didn't see the point, but you're not just passing through, are you?" "No," Hazel said, "we're not." The fire crackled. Lark looked up, her eyes soft. And in the hush that followed, something unspoken passed between the three of them, a vow, quiet and sacred, that they were no longer lost things drifting through storm. They were becoming a home. The heat came early that year, dry and biting, turning the grasses brittle before June was halfway through. Dust clung to every surface, and the air buzzed with the hum of wasps and the restless flicker of things too small to name. Hazel had taken to rising before first light to beat the heat. She liked the hush before the chores began, the way the land looked brushed in ash and silver. Sometimes Elias joined her, sometimes not, but always she felt him near. One morning, as the sun peeled the horizon open, Hazel found him by the fence line, shirt damp with sweat, hat pushed back on his brow. He was fixing a post knocked loose in the last storm, shoulders bowed with effort. She stepped beside him, took up the hammer without a word, and together they worked until the wood stood firm again. When it was done, he sat in the shade of the cottonwood tree, breath slow. Hazel sat beside him, arms braced on her knees. "You ever wonder what life would have been if it had gone another way?" she asked, voice quiet. Elias looked out toward the prairie. Sometimes, used to think that kind of wonderin' was dangerous. And now, he gave a shrug that wasn't really a shrug. Now I think maybe some parts of the past aren't meant to be forgotten, just carried different. Hazel nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. She didn't say it, but her body leaned just slightly toward his, not enough to touch, but close, and he didn't move away. Meanwhile, Lark had begun to sing again. Soft songs, hummed under her breath as she washed linens or stirred stew, nothing full-throated, just sound for the sake of sound. Hazel wept the first time she heard it, hidden, silent, behind the barn wall. Then came the letter. It arrived folded into thirds, tucked in a dusty envelope with Pittsburgh ink on the stamp. Elias found it in town and handed it to Hazel without looking inside. Her hands trembled as she opened it. She read the first lines, and her breath caught. "He's gone." The man who had haunted them, Lark's husband by law if not in love, had been found dead in an alley, knife wound to the gut, no suspects named. The paper carried only a few lines. The law would not be looking for them now. There was no one left to pursue. The past, for the first time, had closed its door. Hazel folded the letter in quarters, pressed it into her apron. Her legs shook beneath her. She turned to Lark, who stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the horizon. "He's dead," Hazel said. "You're free." Lark didn't move. Then she dropped to her knees in the dirt, let out a long, keening breath, not relief, not joy, just something that had waited too long to escape. Hazel ran to her, held her, and they wept into the soil, two sisters who had been prey and were no longer hunted. Later, Elias found them inside, sitting side by side with hands clasped like children who'd made it through a fire. He knelt before them, removed his hat. "You want me to pray?" he asked. Lark met his eyes for the first time without flinching. "Yes." He bowed his head, rough hands open on his knees. "Lord, we don't ask for vengeance, we ask for peace. Let these women rest. Let their tomorrow be gentler than their yesterday. Amen." Hazel didn't consider herself religious, but she felt something lift. The days that followed had a strange lightness. No celebration, just stillness, like a fever broken. The garden bloomed hard and fast, peas curling around trellis, tomatoes swelling under the sun. Elias built a swing from old rope and timber, tied it to the cottonwood. Lark used it most often, her skirts catching wind, hair loose for the first time in years. One evening, Hazel came in late from the well to find Elias at the table with 2 mugs and a bottle he rarely touched. He poured her one. "Figured you might want a drink to the dead," he said, "or to the living." They sat together, the dark settling slow around them, and sipped in silence. Eventually, Hazel spoke. "I don't know what this is between us, what to call it." "You don't have to name it yet," Elias said. "But I've been building a second room onto the cabin. Thought maybe you'd like it, a space that's yours." Hazel set her cup down, eyes wide. "Not just the loft." "No, not the loft." She felt her breath catch, that strange ache again, both terrifying and tender. "You want us to stay then?" "I do." He said it like a vow. Hazel reached for his hand. This time she didn't stop at almost. Their fingers twined, warm and certain, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she let herself believe she'd found something worth keeping. Not rescue, not salvation, just this, a man who'd forgotten how to hope, learning to remember, a woman who had lost her voice, singing again, and a place that might in time become home. July scorched the land until even the pine trees seemed to crackle with thirst. The creek had shrunk to a trickle. Chickens scratched listlessly in the dirt, and the goats spent whole afternoons in the barn's long shadow. It was the kind of heat that made tempers short and silence feel heavier than words. Still, the days held a rhythm that suited them. Elias rose early to tend the fields, his shirt soaked before the sun cleared the ridge. Lark kept the house cool as she could, hanging damp linens in the windows, her fingers nimble with thread and needle. Hazel spent her hours splitting wood in the shade of the lean-to, sweat tracing the curve of her spine. Her arms had grown strong, her hands calloused. She no longer looked like a woman who had fled. She looked like a woman who had stayed. The second room Elias had built stood ready by midsummer, its walls smelling of fresh pine and cedar. Hazel didn't ask when he'd found the time between chores. She only stood in the doorway that first night, her eyes full, then stepped inside and lay her shawl across the wooden chair in the corner. It wasn't luxury, it was something better, belonging. She still shared the loft with Lark some nights, when the nightmares returned. But more and more she stayed below, listening to Elias breathe in the dark from the other side of the cabin, the sound steady and near. Sometimes she thought of telling him more, about the night she pulled Lark from that house, the blood on her hands, the fear that hadn't let her sleep for a year. But he never asked, and she found she didn't need to confess to be understood. He carried silence the way others carried stories, not as burden but as offering. Then late one afternoon, a rider came up the path. The sound of hooves drew Elias from the barn. Hazel and Lark stood in the doorway, hands still slick from the wash basin. The man dismounted with care. He was older, beard streaked with white, a deputy's badge catching the light on his vest. "Name's Keller," he said, tipping his hat. "Out of Carbon County." Elias crossed his arms. "You looking for someone?" "Just checking in. Had a report of 2 women matching their description traveling west last winter. Might not be nothing, but I ask all the homesteads." Hazel's breath hitched. She stepped forward, shoulders squared. "We haven't done anything wrong." Deputy Keller's eyes softened, just slightly. "Didn't say you had, just need to know who's under which roof, with all the things that pass through these parts." "They're under mine," Elias said. "They're Brant's now." The words hit with quiet force. Keller looked from one face to the next, nodded slow. "That'll do then, just keep clear of town for a bit. Some folks ask more questions than need answering." He mounted up and was gone. Hazel turned to Elias, heart pounding. "You told him we were Brant's." "I did. You don't have to say that." "I know," he reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, "but I want to." She didn't cry, just leaned into the touch like a bloom turning toward sun. That night, over beans and cornbread, Lark reached for Elias' hand across the table. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm and sure. He smiled, not with his mouth, but with his whole face, in the way the creases around his eyes deepened. The next morning, Hazel found a ring in the drawer beside her pillow. It wasn't gold or fine, just a thin band of silver, worn smooth, tied with a strip of blue cloth. She carried it out into the yard where Elias stood watching the sky shift from purple to gold. "You leave this for me." "I did." "Why?" "Because I don't want you to feel like you owe me a reason to stay," he said. "Only that you want to." She held it between her fingers. "I do." Lark watched from the porch, a smile flickering like flame across her lips. In her hands, she held a piece of cloth she'd stitched with the shape of 3 sparrows in flight. Hazel slipped the ring onto her finger. Elias said nothing more. He just pulled her close and held her there, arms wrapped gentle around her shoulders. It wasn't a wedding. It wasn't a promise before God or neighbors. It was something older, quieter, more sacred. It was the beginning of a life neither of them had dared imagine. The leaves turned early that year, gold and rust unfurling across the hills like a promise of rest. The wind changed too, no longer sharp, but cool with the scent of wood smoke and earth, turned soft beneath boot and hoof. Lark took to walking the perimeter of the property at dusk. She said it helped her sleep. Hazel often watched her from the porch, Elias beside her, both of them wrapped in shawls and quiet company. Lark's steps were unhurried now, unafraid. She walked like someone who belonged to the land, not someone chased by ghosts across it. Inside, the second room filled with warmth and breath. Hazel's ring glinted on the windowsill in the mornings, set there while she washed. Elias had taken to leaving her notes, small slips of paper with simple things. You made the porch rail shine like new. The coffee tastes better when you brew it. You're safe here. They weren't poems, but she read them like scripture. One afternoon, Lark returned from town with a book of pressed flowers and a new spool of thread. Hazel noticed the way her cheeks stayed flushed long after she came in, the shy way she tugged her sleeves. She didn't ask, not then. But later that night, as they peeled apples for canning, Lark leaned close and whispered, "There's a young man at the apothecary. He waits for me every Tuesday now." Hazel smiled so wide her eyes shone. "Do you like him?" Lark nodded, then added, "But I'm in no hurry. I want to be certain like you." Hazel paused. "I wasn't certain, not at first. But you are now." She looked toward the fire, where Elias sat sharpening a blade, one foot propped, the set of his shoulders easy. "Yes, I am now." The first snow fell while they were stacking the last of the winter wood. It came without warning, soft flakes melting as they landed, turning the air to silver. Lark laughed outright, spinning once beneath it before catching herself. Elias looked at Hazel as if he'd never seen joy look quite like that. They spent the evening inside, all three of them crowded around the table. Hazel sliced apples into a pie tin, Elias smoked his pipe and whittled another sparrow. Lark mended the hem of a woolen coat someone had left behind long ago, now stitched with thread dyed the color of sage. After supper, Hazel brought out a journal. "I think I'll write it down," she said. "Not everything, just the start, the things we left, the things we found." Elias looked up, a quiet pride in his gaze. "Might be someone else needs to read it someday." Hazel nodded. "I think that's why." She wrote by firelight, Lark's head resting against her shoulder. The pen scratched slow across the page. "We were not saved. We saved ourselves, but we were seen, and that was enough to begin again." Outside, the wind rose. A storm maybe, or just the sound of winter arriving. But inside, the house held steady. 3 bodies, 3 hearts, and a fire that had not gone out. Elias touched Hazel's hand as she set the pen down, fingers rough and sure. Lark murmured something in her sleep, a name or a dream. And in that quiet room beneath the weight of snow and sky, the past was still, but the future at last was moving.